Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for May 21st, 2021. And on this episode, I'm sharing with you what I see as the 5 worst federal laws in history. We're going to go all the way back to 1791, just about right out of the gates. And as recently as 2001, there's a ton of other really nasty ones in between. But I've got highlights on these 5 and a bunch of other episodes for you to check out in case you want to learn more. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Quick programming note, it is very likely I will not have an episode next week, Monday. What is that, the 24th? But we'll just see how that all plays out. Anyways, our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives on individual episodes. I've got a bunch of links and references so you can read and learn more. All the different platforms, video, all audio-only podcast edition, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. And we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 15 minutes. We'll see. The hardest part about coming up with the 5 worst laws, 5 worst federal laws in U.S. history, is the fact that we live under the largest government in the history of the world, and every single one of these federal acts is doing violence to the original legal meaning of the Constitution. And that's basically how Thomas Jefferson put it here in 1791. Let me pull this up on the screen. And he put it this way: to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. He recognized, like so many of the other founders and old revolutionaries, they recognized that precedent was a serious problem. Even a tiny step beyond the lines, the chains of the Constitution would lead to another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And this was in his opinion against the constitutionality of the National Bank, against the Bank Bill of 1791. And here from Wiki, they put it this way: the Bank Bill of 1791, and this is the first of these 5 that I want to mention, is a common term for 2 bills passed by the first Congress of the U.S. on February 25th and March 2nd of 1791, and surprise, signed by President George Washington, even against the opinions of his longtime allies in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Edmund Randolph sided with Alexander Hamilton instead. It granted that a bank of the U.S. shall be granted limited legal rights in order to manage the national finance, to obtain loans for the federal government in case of sudden emergencies, and to promote trade and industry. I've done a few episodes on this. For example, last October, October 2nd, 2020, Thomas Jefferson, the Constitution versus the National Bank. That opinion where I took that first quote from, he had a ton of statements. Really, this is not a super long episode, but Jefferson really opposed the National Bank, the first bank of the U.S., the Bank Bill, on 10th Amendment grounds, even though the 10th Amendment hadn't been ratified yet. But under the general principle that the federal government would be one of limited delegated powers and everything else would be reserved to the people of several states. He's basically saying, like, look, we've never delegated this to the federal government, so therefore you can't do it. He also responded to claims that would use the Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. Basically the same type of stuff we hear today. When they can't find something that authorizes it, they just start making different legal arguments to claim that they have the power anyways. James Madison also, and I did another episode on this, James Madison, the Constitution versus the National Bank. I did this in April of this year. He gave a very similar argument rejecting the notion of a national bank on the idea of the general constitutional principle that they can only exercise those powers delegated to it. Even before the 10th Amendment existed, everyone understood that that was how things were supposed to be. He also pointed out that there was a proposal to give the federal government or delegate to the federal government the power to have grant charters of incorporation. It was rejected in Philadelphia. So Madison pointed out, like, look, this wasn't even in the document. We considered it. We said no to it and never even went to the people of the several states for consideration. So therefore, you don't have the power. Anyways, I encourage you to check out both of those episodes. I really enjoyed sharing that information. Now, the first bank of the U.S., signed into law by George Washington, expired in 1811. But a second one was actually brought back in 1816 by James Madison. We've got to talk about that a little bit later. And that one expired sometime around 1840, 1841, something like that. But it really set the precedent. And many of the arguments in support of that back in 1791 were made in support of the Federal Reserve Act, 1913, a very horrible year. Here's how Mike Meharry describes the Federal Reserve, what we live under today. It's far more expansive than those original central banks, but the precedent led to something far worse. The Federal Reserve, Mike writes, serves as the engine that makes all of the U.S. government's unconstitutional spending possible. Without the Fed, the entire system would collapse. So number one, this is not in any particular order. Number one, first one I wanted to cover was the Bank Bill of 1791. The second one goes to 1934. And here from Time, of all places, the first piece of national gun control legislation. I think there was actually another one based on more commerce issues back in 27, but we can say the NFA passed on June 26, 1934. The National Firearms Act was part of President FDR's New Deal for Crime, which was meant to curtail gangland crimes of that era, such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Of course, they always have good reasons to sell this stuff to the public, but they just really want more power. The NFA imposed a tax. Now, the power to tax is the power to destroy, so they imposed a tax on the manufacturing, selling, and transporting of firearms listed in the law, among them short-barrel shotguns and rifles, machine guns, firearm mufflers and silencers, we should call them sound suppressors, really. Due to constitutional flaws, they say. Very milquetoast here. Constitutional flaws is an understatement. The NFA shouldn't have existed. No federal gun control is authorized by the Constitution, period. But the NFA was modified several times. This $200 tax, which I think in current dollars is somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000. This is a ton, which was high for the era, especially if you think about the economic situation in 1934. This was a prohibition, really. It was high for the area. It was put in place to curtail the transfer of those weapons. And another episode I want to mention, of course, is Second Amendment Preservation Foundation to Nullify Federal Gun Control, because once they passed that, they expanded and grew federal gun control measures 1968, 1986, 1988, 2018, and we should be seeing, I'm sure we'll see more in the future from somebody. And this is the strategy. Sooner or later, the people of the several states have to recognize that you are not going to be able to get the federal government through their federal courts, federal Congress, federal imperial, White House, whatever. They are not going to limit their own power. And the only way to protect the Second Amendment, our natural right to keep and bear arms, is to learn how to exercise those rights without relying on the federal government to give us permission. I encourage you to check out that episode for a strategy to nullify these acts into oblivion. Number 3 is the Controlled Substances Act. Another piece of federal prohibition. This one, the CSA from Wikipedia, is a statute establishing federal U.S. drug policy under which the manufacture, importation, possession, use, and distribution of certain substances is regulated. It's generally controlled, prohibited, and has created a national police state in order to enforce that. In fact, there's been a lot of foreign policy adventurism, imperialism, in order to implement this as well. It was signed into law by President Richard Nixon, and it also served as the national implementing legislation for the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. What was that? This was a UN treaty from the 60s, basically international legislation from the UN. They couldn't enforce it, but they called upon each member state to enforce it on their own. The US, of course, they made that happen in a big way. And so that was signed by Nixon in 70 and it went into effect in, I believe, May of 1771. Here's Lawrence Vance in a 2013-2014-ish article that's over at Mises.org, which of course I will link to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Vance puts it this way: one can search the Constitution morning, noon, and night with an electron microscope, X-ray vision, and night vision goggles and never see a reference to the national government having the power to identify drugs, regulate drugs, classify drugs, set up a drug enforcement administration, outlaw drugs, pass a single law related to drugs, or have anything whatsoever to do with any drugs. And I did an episode on this, one of my favorite actually, the Constitution on the War on Drugs, looks like July 15th, 2020. And here's from the summary. Few programs have done such consistent and sweeping damage to the original legal meaning of the Constitution as the so-called war on drugs. It's created an international police state, and it's led to wars, the U.S. government getting involved in all kinds of foreign conflicts, and then, of course, the war on your liberty and the Constitution here at home. I encourage you to check that out. So number 3 is the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. Number 4, I don't think many of you would be surprised to hear me say this one, but the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And here from an article by Mike Meharry. On September 18th, 1850, President Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 into law. I think it was one of the most reprehensible acts in American history based on what it was. It's just a horrible piece of legislation. The Fugitive Slave Act set up a legal structure. This is the federal government trying to keep slavery in check because people were escaping, northern states were resisting, and they were really trying to clamp down on that stuff and shut it down. This is a federal nationwide pro-slavery act. It set up a legal structure to facilitate the capture of runaway slaves and their return to their so-called owners. I like that Meharry puts that in quotes. Abolitionists dubbed it the Bloodhound Law. It significantly expanded the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and was extremely unpopular in northern states. It erased any semblance of due process for an accused runaway slave. Check this out. Mike says a white man could basically drag a black man or woman into slavery on the power of his word. Accused runaways weren't even allowed to testify in their own defense, and those who tried those cases, these commissioners, they got paid double the amount for everyone that got sent in the South back into slavery. It was like $10 if they went to convict or send them to slavery, and $5. So there was a financial incentive as well to send people into slavery. Absolutely disgusting. Of course, we mentioned in this article that it was very unpopular in northern states. In fact, it is one of the most successful issues of nullification of a federal act in history. And I did an episode on that. I've done a number, actually. Here, September 18, 2019, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and nullification by northern states. I will link to that in the show notes like everything else that I'm mentioning here today. And then the last one I want to cover, let's go to Judge Knap. This is October 15th, 2001, when Congress enacted the so-called Patriot Act. They always give them these wonderful names, and they're really just garbage. With minimal floor debate, Knap writes, in the Senate and no floor debate in the House. House members were given only 30 minutes to read the 315-page bill. And if you actually read through it, a lot of it is... it's not even clear. A lot of it is referencing other stuff on the books already. So you're going to have to spend time doing research, say, well, this section, changes this section of this previous part of the code. And it's just insane to have only 30 minutes. And then they vote on it and they pass it anyways. Congress, Judge Knap wrote, enacted this most unpatriotic rejection of privacy and constitutional guarantees. And together with its offspring, again, it sets a precedent. As soon as you do one, they're always going to turn it into more and more and more. The Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal 2004 and the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, the Patriot Act not only permits the execution of self-written search warrants, this is something that the American Revolution was fought over, on a host of new subjects. It rejects the no criminal prosecution protection of its predecessors by requiring evidence obtained contrary to the Fourth Amendment to be turned over to prosecutors and mandating that such evidence is constitutionally competent in criminal prosecutions. That's Judge Knap. There's a great article that he wrote on that as well. And here from John Whitehead, an article that we republished from his great work over at the Rutherford Institute, he wrote that the Patriot Act also redefined terrorism so broadly, and a lot of people cheered this on at the time. It redefined it so broadly because they're so afraid. And we know that fear is the foundation of government power. So they use this fear of like the bad guys coming to get you to cheer on the ability to redefine terrorism. And it's so broad that many non-terrorist political activities such as protest marches, demonstrations, and civil disobedience are now considered potential terrorist acts. Whitehead also says the Patriot Act justified broader domestic surveillance. The logic being that if government agents knew more about each American, they could distinguish the terrorists from law-abiding citizens. No doubt a reflexive impulse shared by small-town police and federal agents alike. I did an episode on this kind of growth of the surveillance state that goes way beyond the Patriot Act. Of course, we generally focus on Section 215, the CDR program, monitoring calls, but it goes way beyond that. Much of the Patriot Act never expires. And here I did this episode November of 2019, Patriot Act on steroids, surveillance state beyond Section 215. And what happened? Out of the Patriot Act, we got so much more. Everything from fusion centers and information sharing to national security letters, TSA-enhanced screening, and the growth of facial recognition. It all came from the Patriot Act and its successor. So those are the 5 that I think are the absolute worst. I'm curious which ones you think I missed. Of course, I skipped over a ton of them because there's so many bad things on the books across the spectrum. We've got the Bank Bill of 1791, the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and the Patriot Act of 2001. And I think we really could close off with this great quote from Roger Sherman. Of course, we have to have this mentality on everything that the government does. And he put it this way: all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. That covers almost everything they've done in our lifetime and for many decades before that. And it really is time for we, the people of the several states, to start treating them that way too. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you're encouraged to check out some of these other episodes that I will link to in the show notes. If you support the show and you want to help us spread the word, you can do so by smashing the like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform, comments in the archives, sharing links, getting notifications. All that stuff tells the platform to show the program to more people. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, as I mentioned right at the outset, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. It's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.